History records the wedding of Arthur Harrington, the 9th Duke of Rothay, as the social triumph of 1842. Society diaries praised the bride's composure, and the Archbishop himself wept at the vows. But history is a liar. The woman trembling at the altar, suffocating beneath heavy Brussels lace, was not the aristocratic bride the Duke had courted. She was a destitute cousin, a sacrificial lamb thrust into a white gown to hide a scandalous elopement. For 3 years, a blind man loved a woman whose real name he did not know, kissing lips that belonged to a phantom, while the true bride plotted her return. London, May 1842. The Montgomery household in Grosvenor Square smelled of panicked sweat and crushed lilies. Upstairs, in the opulent bridal suite, the wedding dress of Cecilia Montgomery lay draped across a velvet settee like a surrendered flag. Arthur Harrington, the Duke of Rothay, was the wealthiest peer in northern England. 3 years prior, a catastrophic carriage accident outside of York had robbed him entirely of his sight. Before the darkness took him, he had been fleetingly betrothed to Cecilia, a famed society beauty. When he survived, scarred but wealthy, Lord Montgomery, Cecilia's father, a man drowning in gambling debts to the notorious Lord George Bentinck, insisted the marriage go forward. Cecilia, however, was repulsed. To her, the blind Duke was a monster, a prison sentence of eternal caretaking. She spent the weeks leading up to the wedding carrying on a clandestine affair with Captain Thomas Linfield, a penniless but breathtakingly handsome cavalry officer. Genevieve Montgomery watched it all from the shadows. As the orphan daughter of Lord Montgomery's disgraced younger brother, Genevieve was treated as little more than an unpaid governess and housekeeper. She was 21, plain by society's standards, but possessed a quiet, resolute strength, and she harbored a devastating secret. She had loved Arthur Harrington since she was 16 years old. She had watched him from the balcony during his courtship of Cecilia, mesmerized by his booming laugh and sharp intellect. After his accident, while Cecilia wept over the tragedy of having a crippled fiancé, Genevieve had secretly devoured medical journals, weeping for the man's pain. The morning of the wedding, disaster struck. At 6 o'clock, a maid found Cecilia's room empty. On the vanity rested a hastily scrawled note. "I cannot be chained to a blind man. Thomas and I have sailed for Calais." Lord Montgomery crumpled the parchment, his face purple with rage and terror. If the Duke discovered this betrayal at the altar, the Montgomery family would be utterly ruined. The creditors would descend by nightfall. Debtors' prison awaited. The scandal would be recorded by every vicious gossip in London, including the diarist Charles Greville, who was already sniffing around the family's finances. Montgomery's frantic eyes darted around the room and landed on Genevieve, who was silently picking up Cecilia's discarded pearl hairpins. "You," Montgomery breathed, his voice trembling with a desperate manic edge. "You are roughly her height. You share the Montgomery coloring." "Uncle," Genevieve whispered, stepping back. "He is blind, Genevieve. He has not seen Cecilia in 3 years. He only knows her voice, and she hardly spoke to him these past months." Lord Montgomery grabbed her shoulders, his grip bruising. "You will put on the dress. You will wear the antique family veil. It is thick enough to obscure your face from the vicar. You will walk down that aisle, and you will save this family." "That is fraud," Genevieve gasped, her heart slamming against her ribs. "It is a crime against God and the Duke. I cannot deceive him." "If you do not," Montgomery snarled, spittle flying from his lips, "I will throw you onto the streets of Cheapside, with nothing but the shift on your back, and I will tell the Duke exactly what his beloved Cecilia thinks of his mangled eyes. I will make sure his humiliation is printed in the Times." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Genevieve thought of Arthur standing alone at the altar of St. George's, Hanover Square, waiting for a bride who loathed him, soon to be the laughingstock of the peerage. The thought of his public humiliation broke something inside her. "I will do it," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "But God forgive us both." For the next 2 hours, the maids strapped Genevieve into Cecilia's silk and lace corset. They pinned the heavy, opaque Brussels lace veil to her hair, pulling it down over her face until the world was nothing but a web of white thread. She was no longer Genevieve. She was a ghost, stepping into a life that was never meant to be hers. The air inside St. George's, Hanover Square was thick with incense and the body heat of 400 aristocratic guests. At the altar, stood Arthur Harrington. He stood tall, a stoic figure in a masterfully tailored black tailcoat. A thin, elegant silk bandage covered his eyes, a stylistic choice he maintained to spare polite society the sight of his scars. He relied on his hearing and smell to navigate the darkness. He heard the rustle of silk, the collective intake of breath from the congregation, and the heavy, rhythmic thud of the church organ playing the processional. Genevieve's hand trembled so violently that Lord Montgomery had to clamp his fingers around her wrist as he walked her down the aisle. Through the heavy lace of her veil, Arthur looked like a marble statue, beautiful and tragic. Every step felt like a betrayal. She was walking toward the man she loved, armed with a catastrophic lie. When Lord Montgomery placed her hand in Arthur's, the Duke's fingers closed over hers. They were warm and strong. Genevieve's breath hitched. Arthur paused, his brow furrowed slightly beneath his silk blindfold. The hand in his was smaller than he remembered, the calluses on the fingertips distinctly unfitting for a society belle who had never worked a day in her life. And the scent, Cecilia, always drenched herself in imported French attar of roses. The woman trembling beside him smelled faintly of lavender soap, old parchment, and rain. "Cecilia," Arthur murmured softly, leaning down. "You are trembling." Panic seized Genevieve's throat. She could not speak. If she used her natural voice, he would know immediately. She forced a harsh, ragged cough into her handkerchief, leaning closer to his ear. "A terrible chill, my lord," she whispered, her voice a raspy, strained hiss. "My throat is entirely raw. Forgive my silence." Arthur squeezed her hand gently, a gesture of profound tenderness that nearly made Genevieve sob. "Do not strain yourself, my dear. I am simply glad you are here." The Archbishop of Canterbury began the liturgy. When it came time to say the vows, Genevieve spoke in the same hoarse, barely their whisper. "I, Cecilia, take thee, Arthur." The words tasted like ash on her tongue. She was committing a mortal sin in the house of God, stealing a sacrament. Yet, when Arthur slipped the heavy gold and sapphire ring onto her finger, she gripped his hand back with fierce, desperate devotion. The reception was a blur of terror. Genevieve remained cloistered in a dimly lit side parlor, using her illness as an excuse to avoid the guests. She kept the thick veil draped over her face, terrified that Charles Greville or the Duke of Wellington might peer too closely and recognize the poor cousin instead of the debutante. That evening, the newly minted Duke and Duchess of Rothay boarded a private train carriage bound for Yorkshire. Alone in the rattling compartment, the immense weight of the deception finally crashed down upon Genevieve. Arthur sat across from her, his cane resting between his knees. "You may take off your veil, Cecilia. There is no one here but us, and I, unfortunately, cannot appreciate the handiwork." Genevieve's hands shook as she unpinned the veil. She looked at his strong, aristocratic face. He was her husband in the eyes of the law, but a stranger in truth. "Your hands," Arthur suddenly said, the rhythmic clacking of the train tracks filling the silence. "They are rough. You did not have calluses before my accident." Genevieve swallowed hard. I took up the harp. "Your Grace," she whispered hoarsely, maintaining the raspy disguise. "During your convalescence, it brought me comfort." A soft, genuine smile spread across Arthur's face. "You played the harp for me? I had no idea you possessed such sentiment, Cecilia. You always seemed so focused on the season's balls." "People change, Arthur," she whispered, tears silently spilling over her cheeks. "Tragedy changes us." "It does," he agreed, reaching out into the empty space between them. Genevieve caught his hand and pressed it to her cheek, letting him feel the warmth of her skin, but carefully keeping her tears from his fingers. "I look forward to learning who you have become, my wife." For the first 6 months, life at Rothay Manor in Yorkshire was a strange, delicate dance on the edge of a knife. Genevieve lived in constant fear of discovery. She dismissed most of the London staff, retaining only the loyal Yorkshire locals who had never met the real Cecilia Montgomery. She maintained her raspy, subdued voice around Arthur, claiming the severe cold had permanently damaged her vocal cords, a lie corroborated by a local, well-bribed physician. But as the days turned into weeks, the terror began to give way to a breathtaking, domestic intimacy. Genevieve realized that Arthur was fiercely independent, but deeply isolated. He had banished the world from his estate, bitter about his condition. Genevieve gently but firmly pushed him back into the light. She read to him for hours in the vast library, not the superficial society gossip the real Cecilia would have preferred, but poetry, philosophy, and estate ledgers. She rode with him on the moors, describing the heather and the jagged cliffs with such vivid, passionate detail that Arthur swore he could see the landscape through her words. One rainy afternoon in October, Arthur was sitting by the fireplace while Genevieve read from John Milton's Paradise Lost. "You skipped a line," Arthur interrupted, a playful smirk on his lips. Genevieve paused, her heart skipping a beat. "I did not." "You did. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. You omitted it. You have memorized it?" she asked, her voice dropping its raspy disguise for just a fraction of a second in her surprise. Arthur tilted his head, listening intently. "Your voice. It sounded clearer just then." I had a sip of hot tea," she recovered quickly, clearing her throat to bring back the huskiness. "It soothes the damage." Arthur reached out, finding her arm and pulling her gently down to sit on the rug beside his chair. He traced the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing over her lips. "I must confess something to you, Cecilia," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Before my accident, I thought I was marrying a beautiful, shallow girl, a suitable duchess, but not a true companion. But the woman you are now, the woman who sits with me in the dark, who runs my estate with a sharper mind than my stewards, who smells of rain and lavender." He leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. It was a deep, consuming kiss, born of months of growing reverence. Genevieve surrendered to it, wrapping her arms around his neck, weeping silently against his skin. "I love you," Arthur whispered against her mouth. "More than I ever thought possible." "I love you," she choked out, the words tearing at her soul. Because he didn't love her. He loved a phantom named Cecilia. By Christmas of 1842, London society was abuzz with rumours. Charles Greville noted in his diary, "The Duke of Rothay has emerged from his northern exile, accompanied by his Duchess. She is notably veiled in public, citing a nervous affliction of the eyes, and speaks in whispers. Yet, those who see them note a profound devotion. The vain Cecilia Montgomery has apparently been replaced by a saint." Genevieve believed she had finally outrun the lie. She was pregnant with Arthur's child, a secret she planned to tell him on New Year's Eve. They had built a sanctuary, a heaven out of hell. But a lie of such magnitude is a living thing, and it demands to be fed. On the morning of December 28th, a heavy winter storm battered the Yorkshire moors. Genevieve was in the drawing room, composing a letter to the estate manager, when the heavy oak doors of the manor swung open. The butler, looking deeply confused, stepped into the room. "Your Grace," he said hesitantly, "there is a woman in the foyer. She is drenched to the bone and demands to see the Duke. She claims to be his wife." Genevieve's blood ran ice-cold. She dropped her pen, the ink splattering across the pristine white parchment like blood. Standing in the doorway of the drawing room, shivering, ruined, but undeniably beautiful, was Cecilia Montgomery. "Hello, Genevieve," Cecilia sneered, her eyes raking over her cousin's expensive velvet gown and the swelling curve of her stomach. "Did you really think you could steal my life forever?" The fire in the drawing room hearth hissed as a sudden draught of freezing Yorkshire wind swept through the manor. Genevieve stared at the woman, dripping onto the Persian rug. The magnificent, haughty Cecilia Montgomery was gone. In her place stood a gaunt, shivering creature in a soiled travelling cloak, her once pristine blonde hair plastered to her cheeks. "Cecilia," Genevieve breathed, instinctively moving her hands to shield her slightly rounded stomach. "How are you here? You were in France." "France is cold when one's lover possesses the morals of an alley cat and the purse of a beggar," Cecilia spat, her teeth chattering. She stepped closer, her eyes sweeping the opulent room, taking in the mahogany furniture, the silver tea service, and the heavy velvet drapes. "Captain Linfield abandoned me in a miserable inn near Montmartre. He took my jewels and whatever coin I had left. It took me months to beg and borrow my way back to England." Genevieve felt the blood drain from her face. "Does your father know?" "My father is hiding from Lord George Bentinck's debt collectors in a miserable cottage in Bath. He is utterly useless," Cecilia sneered, stepping closer. "But imagine my surprise when I finally reached London, destitute and freezing, only to read in the Morning Post that the Duke and Duchess of Rothay are the absolute picture of marital bliss. Imagine my shock to learn that I am supposedly reigning over Yorkshire, draped in diamonds, while the real me was starving in a Parisian gutter. I did what Uncle forced me to do, Genevieve whispered fiercely, finding her courage. I saved your family from ruin. I saved Arthur from unparalleled public humiliation. You saved yourself from the streets, you little thief, Cecilia hissed. She lunged forward, grabbing Genevieve's wrist with a desperate, claw-like grip. But the masquerade is over. I am Cecilia Montgomery. He is my duke. This is my estate. You abhor him, Genevieve cried, wrenching her arm away. You called him a monster. You fled rather than look at his face. Poverty is far more monstrous than a blind man, Genevieve, Cecilia replied, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. I have learned that the hard way. He has £80,000 a year. For that, I will endure his scars. I will not let you destroy him, Genevieve said, lifting her chin. He loves the woman he has known these past 6 months. He loves me. If you go to him now, he will know the difference immediately. Cecilia's eyes narrowed, dropping to Genevieve's waistline. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across her lips. Is that an air you are carrying, cousin? How quaint. Tell me, what do you think the Archbishop of Canterbury will say when he learns of this fraud? The marriage is invalid. You committed a felony. Sir Robert Peel's government is quite strict on matters of aristocratic legitimacy. If I speak, you will be thrown into Newgate prison for fraud. And your precious child? Cecilia leaned in, her breath smelling of stale wine and desperation. Your child will be born a bastard in a cell. And Arthur? He will be the laughingstock of the peerage, humiliated beyond repair, known forever as the blind fool who bedded his wife's penniless cousin. The words struck Genevieve like physical blows. Her breath hitched. If the truth came out, Arthur's pride, the fragile, hard-won peace he had built, would shatter into 1,000 pieces. The scandal would destroy him. And her child? Her innocent child would carry the stain of her crime forever. What do you want? Genevieve choked out, tears finally spilling hot down her cheeks. I want my life back, Cecilia demanded. The storm has made the roads impassable tonight. You will lock yourself in the old nursery wing where the servants will not see you. Tomorrow, when the snow clears, you will take a carriage to the nearest coaching inn and vanish. If you do exactly as I say, I will keep your secret. I will raise the child as my own. But if you defy me, I will walk into his study right now and burn this entire fantasy to the ground. Trapped in an impossible nightmare, Genevieve looked toward the heavy oak doors, knowing Arthur was just down the hall, sitting by the fire, waiting for her to return and finish reading to him. She had built a heaven out of hell, and now the devil had come to claim it. Slowly, defeatedly, Genevieve nodded. Just let me say goodbye to him, in my own way. Cecilia smiled, cold and victorious. Make it brief. The real Duchess has returned. The following evening, the storm had finally broken, leaving Rothay Manor blanketed in an eerie, suffocating silence. Genevieve was locked in a cold, draughty room in the abandoned West Wing, shivering beneath a thin quilt, weeping silently for the husband she had been forced to abandon. Meanwhile, in the grand dining room, Arthur Harrington sat at the head of the long mahogany table. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth did not reach him. He felt an inexplicable, crawling unease. The heavy doors opened, and the rustle of silk announced his wife's arrival. But something was immediately wrong. The footsteps were too heavy, the cadence entirely different, and the scent, a suffocating wave of heavy, imported attar of roses, assaulted his heightened senses, completely overwhelming the familiar, comforting scent of lavender and rain he had come to love. Arthur, darling, a voice trilled brightly. Arthur stiffened. The raspy, whispered huskiness was gone, replaced by a crystalline, ringing soprano. Cecilia? He asked, his brow furrowing beneath his silk blindfold. Your voice. Cecilia glided to the chair beside him, seating herself with a loud scrape of wood against stone. A miracle, my love. The local apothecary sent up a new tincture this morning. I drank it, and within hours, the terrible affliction in my throat vanished entirely. I can finally speak to you as I was meant to. Arthur slowly lowered his wineglass. A miracle indeed, he murmured, his deep voice devoid of its usual warmth. I am astonished. Oh, it is a dreary evening, Cecilia sighed, ignoring his tone. She reached out, placing her hand over his. Arthur flinched. The hand resting on his was soft, perfectly manicured, lacking the calluses on the fingertips that he had memorized over the last 6 months, the calluses earned by playing the harp during his darkest days, the calluses of a woman who managed estate ledgers and rode the moors. "You are cold, Arthur," Cecilia said, pulling her hand back quickly, a faint edge of revulsion in her voice that she could not entirely mask. "Perhaps we should leave this dreadful Yorkshire winter. I was reading today that the Duchess of Sutherland is hosting a magnificent masquerade in London next month. We really must return to society. It is suffocating out here." Arthur sat perfectly still. The woman he had loved these past 6 months despised London. She had told him only yesterday that the moors were their private Eden. She had spent the morning discussing crop rotations with the steward, not pining for society masquerades. "We were reading Milton yesterday, before the storm," Arthur said quietly, testing the waters. "Do you recall where we left off?" Cecilia let out a forced, airy laugh. "Oh, Arthur, you know I find that heavy poetry so dreadfully dull. Let us not speak of Milton when we could be discussing our return to Mayfair." The blood rushed to Arthur's ears. His heart began to pound a violent, frantic rhythm against his ribs. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. The woman who had quoted that to him, who had wept in his arms, who had kissed him with a fiery, desperate passion, was not the woman sitting beside him. He did not know how it was possible. He did not know the mechanics of the deception, but blindness had taught Arthur Harrington to see the world in absolute truths, stripped of visual illusions. The soul of his wife had vanished, replaced by an empty, perfumed shell. Arthur suddenly stood up, his chair crashing backward onto the stone floor. "Arthur!" Cecilia gasped, startled. "Whatever is the matter?" He reached out blindly, his large hands finding her shoulders. He pulled her up, his grip like iron. He didn't care if he bruised her. "Who are you?" Arthur demanded, his voice a terrifying, thunderous roar that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "Arthur, you are hurting me. It is I, Cecilia," she cried, genuine panic bleeding into her voice. "You are not the woman who stood beside me yesterday," Arthur snarled, his face inches from hers. His heightened senses catalogued every lie, the wrong perfume, the wrong voice, the wrong hands, the wrong heart. "Where is she? Where is my wife?" "I am your wife," Cecilia shrieked, struggling against his grip. "I am Cecilia Montgomery. We were married at St. George's. You are mad." "If you do not tell me the truth this instant," Arthur whispered, a deadly, ice-cold threat, "I will have my guards throw you out into the snow, and I will tear this manor apart stone by stone until I find her." The silence in the grand dining room of Rothay Manor was absolute, shattered only by the ragged, terrified breathing of the woman Arthur Harrington held by the shoulders. His unseeing eyes were fixed on her face, his expression a terrifying mask of aristocratic fury. The heavy, imported attar of roses that clung to her skin was suffocating to his heightened senses, a cloying, the artificial stench that completely masked the comforting scent of rain and lavender he had spent the last 6 months learning to breathe. "I will ask you one final time," Arthur said. His voice had dropped from a thunderous roar to a deadly, even cadence that was far more frightening. It was the voice of a man who commanded thousands of acres, hundreds of tenants, and possessed a Cecilia Montgomery, accustomed only to the sycophantic praise of London dandies and the superficial squabbles of Mayfair drawing rooms, crumbled under the sheer, terrifying force of a man who had survived the darkness. She tried to twist away, her silk skirts rustling violently against the mahogany chairs, but Arthur's hands were like iron vices. "I am Cecilia," she sobbed, struggling uselessly. Panic was bleeding through her aristocratic veneer, stripping away the haughty superiority she had worn since childhood. "Arthur, please, you are hurting me. It is the truth. The woman you have been living with. She is an impostor. She is Genevieve, my cousin, Genevieve Montgomery." The confession hung in the freezing air of the dining room, pathetic and vile. Arthur released her so suddenly that Cecilia stumbled backward, her spine crashing loudly against the edge of the heavy dining table. She gasped, rubbing her bruised arms, weeping genuine tears of self-pity. Genevieve. Arthur stood perfectly still, letting the name wash over him. It tasted strange on his tongue, a sudden, jarring displacement of reality. Yet, As the syllables settled into his mind, they resonated with an absolute, profound rightness. He searched his memories from before the carriage accident, before the darkness took his sight. He remembered the glittering, vain Cecilia, always demanding attention, always preening before the mirrors of the Montgomery townhouse. But hovering in the background of those memories, relegated to the shadows like a forgotten piece of furniture, was another figure, a quiet, observant orphan. He vaguely recalled a girl who had once nervously handed him a cup of tea in Lord Montgomery's library, her fingers trembling slightly, her voice a soft, intelligent murmur when she dared to speak. That was Genevieve, the destitute cousin, the unpaid governess. "She took your place," Arthur stated, his voice devoid of all emotion as he pieced the catastrophic puzzle together. "My father forced her to do it," Cecilia cried defensively, desperate to cast the blame away from her own scandalous elopement. "I fled to France with Captain Linfield. I could not bear to be tied to a cripple. My father was drowning in gambling debts to Lord George Bentinck. If the wedding did not go forward, the creditors would have destroyed us." He made Genevieve put on the veil. "She is a criminal, Arthur. She stole my life." Arthur's jaw clenched. The thought of Lord Montgomery, a weak, snivelling man who gambled away his family's honor, forcing a terrified 21-year-old girl to commit a felony before the Archbishop of Canterbury, made Arthur's blood run entirely cold. "Where is she?" Arthur demanded, turning his head sharply toward the sound of Cecilia's whimpering. "I told her to leave," Cecilia shrieked, her voice shrill with defensive panic. "I told her to pack her meager belongings and vanish into the snow by morning, or I would expose the fraud to the authorities. Do you not understand the peril she has placed you in? If Sir Robert Peel or the magistrates discover this, she will hang at Newgate Prison, and you will be utterly ruined. You will be the laughing stock of the peerage, the blind fool who bedded the help." Arthur slowly turned his face back toward her. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop. "If you ever speak of my wife again," Arthur hissed, his voice pure venom, "I will ensure Lord George Bentinck receives your exact coordinates by telegraph. I will buy your father's debts myself, and you can both spend the rest of your miserable lives rotting in the Fleet prison." He did not wait for her to reply to the threat. Arthur turned on his heel and strode out of the dining room. He did not reach for his cane. He did not need it. For 6 months, Genevieve had walked every inch of Rothay Manor with him. She had spent countless hours guiding his hands over the doorframes, counting the steps to the grand staircase, describing the exact placement of the Persian rugs and the Grecian urns until the map of his home was burned flawlessly into his mind. She had given him back his independence. She had given him back his life. As he moved through the vaulted stone halls, the fury in his chest began to war with a terrifying, desperate panic. She was leaving. The woman who had read Milton to him by the fire, who had kissed him with such fierce, desperate devotion, who smelled of lavender and possessed a mind sharper than any scholar in Oxford. She was packing her bags to flee into a deadly Yorkshire blizzard. "Mrs. Hughes," Arthur bellowed. His voice echoed like cannon fire off the high ceilings, rattling the portraits of his ancestors. The loyal Yorkshire housekeeper, who had been hovering anxiously in the servants' corridor, scurried forward. Her footsteps were light, but Arthur could hear the frantic rhythm of her breathing. "Your Grace?" she squeaked. "Where did that woman send Genevieve?" he demanded, not stopping his relentless pace toward the main stairwell. Mrs. Hughes swallowed hard. She had known something was terribly wrong when the new Duchess had arrived in the drawing room, dripping wet and speaking in a haughty, unfamiliar soprano. The staff had whispered for months that the Duchess seemed entirely different from the vain girl the Duke had originally courted, but they had loved the gentle, kind woman who actually managed the estate. "The old nursery wing, Your Grace," Mrs. Hughes stammered, tears springing to her eyes. "In the far west corridor, the woman who just arrived. She forced her Grace into the corner room. She locked the heavy oak door and took the brass key with her. Bring a heavy iron poker from the main hearth," Arthur commanded, his hand finding the polished mahogany banister. "Follow me. Now." The west wing of Rothay Manor was practically abandoned, entirely cut off from the central heating systems that kept the main house warm. As Arthur strode down the long, draughty corridor, the air grew increasingly frigid. The cold seeped through the soles of his boots. The thought of Genevieve, who was carrying his child, locked in a freezing room with no fire, made a dark, violent rage flare behind his unseeing eyes. When Arthur reached the heavy oak door of the old nursery, he placed his hands flat against the freezing wood. He traced the surface until he found the brass lock mechanism. A moment later, Mrs. Hughes arrived, panting heavily, the heavy iron poker clutched in her hands. "Give it to me," Arthur said, holding out his hand. Mrs. Hughes hesitated, terrified of the Duke's wrath. "Your Grace, the wood is thick. Shall I summon the estate guards to break it?" "Give me the iron, Mrs. Hughes." She placed the cold, heavy metal into his palm. Arthur gripped it tightly, stepping back to gauge the distance. He raised the iron poker high above his head and brought it down on the brass lock casing with a single, shattering blow. The sound of metal tearing and wood splintering echoed down the empty corridor like a gunshot. Arthur struck it a second time, putting all the weight of his broad shoulders into the swing. The locking mechanism gave way with a harsh groan, and the heavy oak door swung inward, crashing against the interior stone wall. Arthur dropped the iron poker. It clattered loudly against the floorboards, rolling away into the darkness. He stepped over the threshold into the freezing room. The air here smelled faintly of neglect, dust, and damp stone. But beneath it all, faint but undeniable, was the desperate, familiar scent of lavender. He heard a sharp, terrified intake of breath from the far corner of the room. "Genevieve," he called out softly, his voice trembling for the first time that evening. "Arthur," came the raspy, broken whisper. It was her true voice, stripped of the pretense, stripped of the forced huskiness she had maintained for half a year. It was rough from weeping and shivering. The sound of it struck him directly in the heart. "You shouldn't be here," Genevieve sobbed, the sound of her rustling skirts indicating she was pressing herself further into the corner. "You must not look at me. She will ruin you. Cecilia will tell Charles Greville and the Times. She will ruin everything you have built. I am a fraud, Arthur. I am a criminal." Arthur crossed the room in 3 long, deliberate strides, following the sound of her weeping until his knees bumped against the edge of a small, narrow cot. He reached down into the darkness, his large hands frantically searching until they found her shivering, fragile shoulders beneath a thin, inadequate quilt. He pulled her up with sudden, desperate strength, crushing her against his chest and burying his face in the crook of her neck. She was freezing, her skin like ice, but as he held her, a profound, overwhelming warmth flooded his chest. "You foolish, brave, extraordinary woman," Arthur murmured fiercely into her hair, his arms locking around her waist to ensure she could never pull away. "Did you truly believe a name, a piece of parchment, or a wretched veil could make a difference to me?" Genevieve broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably into his coat. Her hands came up, her fingers clutching his lapels as if she were drowning in a violent sea and he was the only solid ground left on earth. "I lied to you," she wept, her tears soaking through his thick wool coat. "I stood in the church, before the Archbishop, and I lied before God. I stole a sacrament. I stole a life that was not mine." "You did not steal a life. You saved mine," Arthur corrected gently, his voice thick with emotion. He brought his hands up, his thumbs sweeping away the freezing tears from her cheeks. He memorized the shape of her face, the slope of her nose, the softness of her lips. She was not a phantom, she was real. He trailed his right hand down, resting it reverently over the slight, hidden swell of her stomach beneath her woolen dress. "And you are carrying my heir," he whispered, awe threading through his tone. "Our child. A child forged from love, not from a ledger of debts." "But the law," Genevieve choked out, her hands covering his where it rested on her stomach. "The scandal. Lord Hardwicker's Marriage Act is merciless, Arthur. They will declare our marriage invalid. They will say my child is illegitimate." "Let them try," Arthur said, a grim, dangerous smile finally touching his lips. He pulled his own heavy wool coat from his shoulders and wrapped it tightly around her shivering frame, cocooning her in his warmth. "I am the Duke of Rothay. I possess enough wealth and parliamentary influence to rewrite the laws of this land, if I so choose. We are going to summon Sir William Follett, the finest Solicitor General in London, to this estate by week's end." "Sir William?" Genevieve breathed, stunned by the sheer scale of his immediate defiance. "We will have the fraudulent marriage to Cecilia annulled on grounds of non-consummation and deceit," Arthur declared, lifting her effortlessly into his arms. She weighed practically nothing. "And then we will wed properly, under your true name, in the light." "And what of Cecilia?" Genevieve whispered, resting her head against his steady, beating heart as he carried her out of the freezing nursery. "Cecilia will receive a one-way ticket to a remote convent in Tuscany," Arthur replied coldly, his boots echoing down the corridor as he carried his true wife back toward the warmth of the main house. "She wanted to be a martyr to poverty. I am simply obliging her. The phantom is gone, Genevieve. There is only you and I." The morning of December 29th broke over the Yorkshire moors with a brutal, blinding clarity. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a frozen, crystalline world of jagged ice and suffocating silence. Inside the grand study of Rothay Manor, the atmosphere was equally frigid. Arthur Harrington stood by the massive hearth, his unseeing eyes fixed toward the sound of the scratching quill. At the heavy mahogany desk sat Cecilia Montgomery, her once pristine blonde hair pinned back in a harsh, unyielding style, her face pale and drawn. Flanking her were two of Arthur's most imposing estate guards, their presence a silent, violent promise. "Sign the final addendum," Arthur commanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Cecilia's hand trembled so violently that a drop of black ink splattered across the heavy vellum. "This is exile," she whispered, her voice cracking with a mixture of terror and lingering aristocratic entitlement. "You are sending me to a convent in San Gimignano. I do not speak Italian. Arthur, I will be a prisoner among stone walls and silent nuns. You are fortunate. I am a man who respects the sanctity of a woman's life. Cecilia, however wretched that woman might be," Arthur replied coldly, stepping away from the fire. He relied on the echo of her ragged breathing to orient himself. "Had you perpetrated this fraud upon any other peer of the realm, you would be sitting in a damp cell in Newgate awaiting trial for forgery and deception. You abandoned me at the altar. You abandoned your cousin to my wrath. You are trading the gallows for the Tuscan sun. I suggest you show some gratitude." "You are a fool," Cecilia spat, dropping the quill. The venom in her voice was absolute. "You are trading a diamond for a pebble. Genevieve is nothing, a penniless orphan. Society will look at her plain face, and they will know you have been duped. You will be the laughingstock of Mayfair." Arthur's face remained a mask of flawless, aristocratic indifference. "I am trading a viper for a woman of unparalleled grace. As for society, the Duke of Rothay answers to no one. Guard, take her to the carriage. If she attempts to alter her route to Italy, freeze her stipends immediately and alert the local magistrates." As the heavy oak doors closed behind the screaming, thrashing phantom of his past, Arthur finally let out a long, shuddering breath. The air in the study felt cleaner, lighter, but the nightmare was not entirely over. The architect of this treason still remained. 2 weeks later, as the snows finally began to melt into the heather, a hired hackney carriage clattered into the cobblestone courtyard of Rothay Manor. The man who stepped out was shivering, smelling of cheap gin and stale tobacco. It was Lord Montgomery, Genevieve's uncle. He had received a desperate, smuggled letter from Cecilia before she boarded her ship at Dover, detailing the catastrophe. Seeing an opportunity to salvage his ruined finances, Montgomery had travelled north to extort the blind Duke. When Montgomery was ushered into the library, he found Arthur seated behind his desk, Genevieve standing quietly by his side. Her hand rested on Arthur's shoulder, a silent, grounding anchor. "Ah, Your Grace," Lord Montgomery forced a booming, jovial tone that reeked of desperation. "And my sweet niece, Genevieve. What a bizarre misunderstanding this has all been. But fear not, the Montgomery family is entirely prepared to keep this little substitution a profound secret, for a modest consideration, of course." Arthur did not move. He listened to the frantic, erratic rhythm of Montgomery's heartbeat, the nervous shuffling of his boots on the Persian rug. "A consideration?" Arthur repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "And what sum do you believe buys the silence of a man who sold his own blood to pay his gambling debts?" Montgomery swallowed hard. £50,000. Your Grace, a pittance for a man of your vast holdings. If you refuse, I shall go straight to the editor of the Times. I will tell them the Duke of Rothay was too blind to know he was bedding a common housekeeper instead of a noblewoman." Genevieve stiffened, her fingers digging into Arthur's velvet coat, but Arthur merely reached up and covered her hand with his own. "You are a man who deals in ledgers and debts, Lord Montgomery," Arthur said, leaning back in his leather chair. "So, let us discuss your ledgers." Specifically, your markers held by Lord George Bentinck. Montgomery's breath hitched. How? How do you know of those? Because 3 days ago, my solicitor purchased them, Arthur revealed, a cruel, triumphant smile touching the corners of his mouth. Every single one of them. I own your debts, Montgomery. I own the mortgage on your pathetic townhouse in Bath. I own the very shirt on your back. You owe me £85,000. The silence in the library was absolute, broken only by Montgomery's wheezing gasps. If you breathe a word of my wife's true identity to a single living soul, Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a terrifying, icy whisper, I will call in those debts by sunset. I will have you thrown into the Fleet prison, and I will personally bribe the turnkeys to ensure you are placed in the deepest, most disease-ridden cell they possess. You will rot in the dark, Montgomery, and unlike me, you will not have an angel to guide you through it. Mercy, Montgomery whimpered, falling to his knees, the sound of his bones hitting the floorboards echoing sharply. I beg of you, your grace. Your carriage is waiting, Arthur said, dismissing him with a flick of his wrist. Do not ever show your face in Yorkshire again. With the threats neutralized, the true work of reclaiming their lives began. Arthur summoned Sir William Follett, the finest Solicitor General in London, to Rothay Manor. For a week, the brilliant legal mind pored over the parish registers and the complexities of Lord Hardwicke's Marriage Act. It requires a delicate touch, Your Grace, Sir William explained one evening by the fire. The marriage to Cecilia was never consummated. As she fled, the marriage to Genevieve was enacted under a false name, rendering the banns fraudulent. Technically, in the eyes of the law, you are a bachelor, and the young lady is entirely unwed. Then fix it, Arthur commanded. I want my child born to a legitimate duchess. Using his immense wealth and political influence, Arthur secured a quiet, private annulment from Bishop Blomfield of London, erasing the disaster of St. George's, Hanover Square, from the official ecclesiastical records. On a rain-swept afternoon in late February, Arthur and Genevieve stood before the altar of the private, ancient stone chapel on the Rothay estate. There were no 400 aristocrats, there was no suffocating incense, no whispering gossips, and no heavy Brussels lace veil. Genevieve wore a simple, elegant gown of deep sapphire velvet. She stood before the local vicar, holding Arthur's hands tightly. I, Arthur Harrington, take thee, Genevieve Montgomery, Arthur said. His voice was strong, echoing off the stained glass windows. He traced the knuckles of her hand, feeling the familiar calluses, the absolute truth of her, to have and to hold, from this day forward, in the light and in the dark. I, Genevieve, she whispered, her voice thick with tears of profound joy, take thee, Arthur, for all the days of my life. When he kissed her, it was not the desperate, fraught embrace of two people hiding from the world. It was a vow of absolute permanence. She was no longer a phantom, she was real, and she was his. Spring arrived in Yorkshire with a fierce, blooming beauty, carpeting the moors in vibrant purple heather. In mid-April, the true Duchess of Rothay went into labour. For Arthur, the 14 hours of her confinement were a unique kind of torture. Trapped in his blindness, he could not see the reassuring nods of the midwife or the physician. He could only hear. He paced the length of the grand hallway outside the master suite, his cane striking the floorboards in a relentless, frantic rhythm. Every gasp, every cry of pain from Genevieve felt like a knife twisting in his own chest. He felt violently useless. Arthur, Mrs. Hughes said softly, touching his arm as the sun began to set. Come, she is asking for you. He abandoned his cane, practically running into the bedchamber. The room smelled of sweat, blood, and the comforting, sharp scent of lavender. He found the edge of the bed and dropped to his knees, his hands frantically searching until they found Genevieve's damp forehead. I am here, he breathed, kissing her skin. I am here, my love. Listen, Genevieve whispered, her voice exhausted but trembling with a ferocious joy. From the bundle resting against her chest came a small, insistent whimper, followed by a robust, demanding cry. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. Tears, hot and unbidden, spilled from his unseeing eyes, soaking into the silk bandage he wore. Gently, Genevieve guided his large, trembling hands toward the bundle. He felt the impossible warmth of the child. He traced the impossibly tiny, fragile fingers, the soft curve of the cheek, the fine down of hair on the crown of the head. It was a sensory miracle, a life he had helped create out of the ashes of a magnificent lie. "A son," Genevieve murmured, pressing a kiss to Arthur's wrist. "We shall call him William." "William," Arthur repeated, a reverent prayer. "He is perfect. You are perfect. He has your chin," she laughed softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "But I fear he has my stubbornness." By the autumn of 1843, it was impossible to hide from society any longer. The Tun was clamoring for the return of the Duke of Rothay and his elusive, mysterious Duchess. Rumors had swirled wildly through the drawing rooms of Mayfair, whispers of madness, of a disfigured bride, of scandalous divorces. Arthur decided to face the vipers on his own terms. He hosted a magnificent, exclusive dinner at his Mayfair townhouse, inviting the most notorious gossips of the era, including the diarist Charles Greville and the sharp-tongued Lord Palmerston. When the double doors of the drawing room opened, silence fell over the gathered aristocrats like a heavy shroud. Arthur entered first, striking a dashing, tragic figure in his black evening clothes, his silk blindfold firmly in place. On his arm was Genevieve. She wore a gown of emerald silk that perfectly complemented her dark coloring. She wore no veil. She held her head high, her expression serene, radiating a quiet, formidable intelligence that the real Cecilia had never possessed. She did not look like the glittering, vain girl they remembered from seasons past. She looked like a queen. Greville squinted, his monocle slipping from his eye. He leaned toward Lord Palmerston, whispering frantically, "She looks entirely changed. The coloring is a Montgomery, but the face. It is as if she is a different woman entirely. Perhaps marriage to a blind man ages a woman," Palmerston muttered back, though he could not take his eyes off the striking couple. Arthur, whose hearing easily picked up their whispered exchange across the room, smiled coldly. He led Genevieve to the center of the room and called for a glass of champagne. "My lords and ladies," Arthur projected, his voice commanding absolute attention, "I thank you for joining us to celebrate the birth of my son and heir, William Harrington, the Marquess of Beaumont. But more importantly, I raise my glass to my wife." He turned to Genevieve, lifting her hand to his lips. "Society places great value on what can be seen, the cut of a gown, the beauty of a face, the sparkle of a diamond, but my darkness has afforded me a far greater privilege. I have seen the absolute truth of a woman's soul. To Her Grace, the Duchess of Rothay." To the Duchess, the room echoed, their malicious gossip entirely neutralized by the sheer, undeniable power of the Duke's devotion. They had won. The phantom bride was banished, the architect of the lie was ruined, and the true woman stood victorious in the light. The scandalous truth of Arthur and Genevieve Harrington's marriage remained entirely buried for nearly a century, locked away in the private vaults of the Rothay estate. It was only when historians uncovered the Duke's personal letters in the early 1900s that the magnitude of the deception and the profound depth of their romance was finally brought to light. Genevieve Montgomery had walked down the aisle, a terrified impostor, a pawn in a desperate aristocrat's game of survival. Yet, in the quiet, shadowed halls of a Yorkshire manor, she forged an unbreakable bond built on genuine intellect, shared pain, and quiet sacrifice. The blind Duke and his phantom bride defied the rigid, unforgiving laws of Victorian society, proving that true sight requires no eyes, and true love cannot be hidden beneath a veil. Their legacy remains one of history's most extraordinary, triumphant masquerades.